Okay, so welcome everybody to our 190th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. I could see a few faces, folk here, and it's great as always to have Dave Berri presenting before he presents his paper on the WNBA, Exploring the Gender Wage Gap in a World of Exogenous Revenues, the Case of Professional Basketball. Just to flag a few things up, first of all, we are as always, hosted by the University of Reading and sponsored by the Sports Economics Review, which you can perhaps see on my left, depending on how much of me you can see. But it's the journal in sports economics, published by Elsevier, a good home for many sports economics papers that have appeared in the Roses series over the years. Just to say a few bits and bobs about conferences, I mentioned last week the submission deadline for Maths Sport 11 taking place in the summer in Luxembourg. That deadline was extended to today, so if you missed it last week, do have a go at that today. And as always, there's a whole bunch of conferences coming up planned for the summer. The Gijón 19th Sports Economics Congress in Gijón. This abstract deadline for that will be on April 1st. And that conference will be on the 9th and 10th of May. There's also the Athens University of Economics and Business Sports Analytics Workshop coming up in May. Call for papers out for that. And I've mentioned a few times, but if you don't know it already, I'm organising a conference next week at the stadium behind me, Oldham Athletic Stadium in northeast Manchester. And if you're interested in joining for that event, which has a range of interesting speakers, including Christina Philippou, who is presented here, and Kieran Maguire, please do let me know. I'll put information in the chat as always. Final thing I will just mention is that March the 1st is not a million miles away, and that will be the deadline for the second Latin American Sports Economics Conference in Lima in Peru, where Stefan Szymanski and Dave Forrest will be keynote speakers. I don't want to hold up Dave any longer. It's a pleasure to have you as always, Dave. Please do take away your talk.
Thank you. Thank you for all joining me this morning, and thanks for having me. I was, even though this is very early, I like doing this. Let me start. This is a paper I wrote last fall, I guess, and it's almost like it's two papers. So I'm going to tell you a story at the beginning of the paper that sounds kind of pretty, not terribly different from other things I've written. And then I'm going to tell you a story at the end that I think this is something that is happening that I don't know that we have thought about a lot before in sports economics. I'm going to talk about that. So let me share my screen with you. Wait a minute, did I do that or not? Did that share or not? Okay, so you can see the presentation?
Not on full screen though.
Oh. Can you see it now?
No, we now see a blue. Just see a desktop.
Well, that isn't good. Let's try this again. What are we doing wrong here? Okay, let's try this. All right, so I'm going to try this again. Okay, all right, so if I put it over there, we'll see if we can get this to work. So now or not?
You can see your slides, but still not the slideshow, just PowerPoint.
Oh, that's all. Yeah. So now you can see the slides, right?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Perfect. All right, we're in good shape now. All right, we're ready to go. All right. Okay. Let me. I want to. I know we're sponsored by Sports Economics Review here, but I do want to draw people's attention to this journal. Young-Hoon Lee in South Korea has started a journal a couple years ago, and I know Mike Leeds and Tony Krautman and Rod Ford and I have all published in this. It's the International Journal of Empirical Economics. And so this paper that I'm going to talk about here is, in my mind, kind of a sequel to the paper that I published in IGE last spring. And I also presented this at a Rosa seminar, this paper before as well. This paper that got published is looking at The NBA and ABA, when back in the late 60s, early 70s, what basketball players were worth at that point. And this paper is kind of building off of that. I want to start off just by noting that we can go through and we can measure the economic value or the marginal revenue product of athletes in sports, and this has been done. And these are all papers that I've published. So Tony Krautman and I did a paper on Major League Baseball pitchers and said Bob Gibson was worth $247,000 in 1968. Rick Berri, noted in another paper, was worth $21,000 in 68, 69. In another paper, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was worth $461,000 in 73, 74. In college sports, Tyus Jones was worth $2.8 million about 10 years ago. A paper that just came out in the last year or so, Lauren Hager, we found was worth about $79,000. So this is not something surprising to be looked at. People have tried to do things like this for a very long time. What's going to be different? This paper is going to be a little different. We're going to look at the WNBA, and there's something unique about the WNBA that is not found in other sports, and sort of a hint of where we're going with this, but perhaps not much of a hint. But this is a quote from Susan Hebert. So I do know people in the WNBA, so I've gotten to know these people as in my work as a quasi-journalist. So Susan Hebert is somebody I've spoken to, CEO of the Atlanta Dream. And she made an interesting observation once in a conversation with me. And this is kind of how the WNBA is different than other sports leagues. In other sports leagues, the owners own the teams and the league. The WNBA doesn't quite work that way. As Susan Hebert put it, if the 12 WNBA owners say they want to do something and the NBA says no, the answer is no. The NBA owns as much of the WNBA as the owners of the WNBA own. And the NBA appears to have veto power. And so this is going to be an important point as we go along, that the WNBA does not manage its own league. The NBA does this. So we're gonna come back to that point, but we want to keep that in mind as we go along here. All right, I want to start off with the NBA early on in its history. Again, this is building off of that previous paper. You can see in the data that the NBA in the late 60s, early 70s makes a substantial leap in its revenues. And this is data that comes from Roger Knoll. Roger Knoll at this point in time was asked to do testimony to the U.S. Senate in dealing with the NBA-ABA merger. And so as part of that testimony, he was given financial data on the NBA and the ABA, and I was using that in the previous paper, and I'm using that here. And you can see in the data that league revenue, if you take a look at what average team revenue was and how many teams there were, you can calculate what you estimate the league revenue was likely to be. League revenue goes from 12.6 million to almost 30 million in a span of about 5 years. If you adjust for today's dollars, that leap is basically 100 million to 200 million. And it happens in a span of just 3 or 4 years that we see this leap, 100 million to 200 million. And this occurs in the NBA's third decade. So the NBA makes this leap from year 22 to year 26. At this point in time, there is no really women's professional league in North America. And there's a reason for that. Women's basketball is introduced in 1892, 1 year after Naismith invents the game. And so women are playing this game very early on. But very soon after women start playing it in the 1890s, a number of institutions start banning women from playing it. They certainly don't financially support them doing this. And it's not until Title IX passes in 1972, or 80 years after this, that women's basketball starts to get significant funding at the college level. And that means that in North America, there just really isn't a large talent base to build a professional league off of. So women's professional basketball gets gets delayed because there just isn't any support at the college level. Jenna Haig at Bloomberg wrote an article a couple years ago noting that WNBA begins in 97. Now we're in its third decade. And we see the WNBA, it goes from in 2019 to 2023, her article notes WNBA revenue doubles from 100 million to 200 million. This is in the WNBA's 23rd to 26th, 27th year. So it's almost exactly the same time period. NBA and WNBA revenue makes almost exactly the same leap at the same point in its history. And so it appears the WNBA is on exactly the same trajectory, at least in 2023. It appears it's the same trajectory that the NBA was on. Now, this leads me to the research question of this paper. How does the pay and MRP of NBA players during its $100 million leap in its third decade compare to the pay and MRP of the WNBA players when the women's league made the same leap? So that's the question that I want to look at in this paper. So we're going to start off with the NBA, and I'm going to focus on Walt Frazier as the player that I want to focus on. And so Walt Frazier enters the league in 1967, and he's paid $25,000 when he starts. He sees his pay increase to $50,000 in 68-69, then $75,000 in 69-70. And that suggests that, as he goes out of his rookie year, his pay is approaching his MRP. To see whether that's true, we're gonna adopt an approach that that I have called the Berri Goff approach, simply because Goff and I haven't told him that I do this, so I probably should tell him that I do this, but he and I, we did almost exactly the same approach to measuring marginal revenue product at the college level. I did it in an article in The Atlantic. This was probably about 8 or 9 years ago, and Goff's article appeared at Forbes a week later. It was like a week or 2 weeks. It was almost exactly the same time period, and we did almost exactly the same thing. I subsequently wrote it up in some academic articles, but I've always given Ryan Goff this credit that he came up with the same idea. So this is essentially, the how we look at it. This is not the Scully approach. There are lots of issues with the Scully approach, and I detailed that in my Roses presentation last year, and I've talked about it before, and I don't want to go through all that again. So this is the basic approach that I've used in a number of articles now. How do you measure the marginal revenue product of an athlete? So the first step is you look at how much league revenue should go to the players, and as Tony and I detailed in 2019, and I've talked about in subsequent work, the NBA sort of has a rule that it's 50%. That's similar to what we see in the NFL. It's similar to what we see in Major League Baseball. Obviously, in European sports leagues, it's more because there's fewer restrictions on pay. But in North America, it seems to be 50%. So if we just take 50% as that's what we're going to pay the players. In 69-70, the NBA has 18.6 million, so we give 50% to the players. That's 9.3 million. Step two, you got to figure out, this is something that's lacking in the Scully approach. Every player who's employed has to get paid something, because all of them participate in practice. And practice is actually important. And so you can't just credit players for what they do in the actual games. They actually are doing other work. And leagues all have minimum wages that they pay their players. In earlier work, I would go through and calculate what a minimum wage likely would be if there wasn't one. But in the NBA at this point in time, there actually is a minimum wage. It's $13,500. New York Times reported that. So we know what the minimum wage was in the NBA at this particular point in time. Then you go through and you figure out the dollar value of the win. So to calculate that, you say, okay, every player is guaranteed the minimum wage. There's 171 players in the league, so they get $2.3 million in minimum wages. The remaining $7 million that you allocated to the players are going to be allocated according to each player's production of wins. And that means that each win ends up being worth $11,600. And essentially if you do a Scully revenue regression on wins, that 11,625 would essentially be the coefficient that you would estimate. But there are issues with doing that regression, and again, I've detailed that in previous articles that's not a very reliable way of getting at what the value would be. So we end up with this value of a win is 11,000, and so then we go figure out how many wins Walt Frazier produced. And you can do that just based on the box score data. There's limited box score data in 69-70. It's not very complete. They don't have offensive and defensive rebounds. They don't have steals at this point. They don't track block shots. They don't block turnovers. But in earlier work, I went through and said, given the data we have, we can, make an estimate of what we think the wins produced was likely to be. And Walt Frazier led the NBA in wins in 69-70, produced 19.6 wins. So then Frazier's MRP would be 13,500 is his minimum wage, 11,625 is the dollar value of a win. He produced 19 wins. So in 69-70, he's worth $240,000. He was paid $75,000, so he was pretty much underpaid. He wasn't paid what he was worth. The ABA did exist at this point in time in 69-70, but it was it's only in its third year. And at this point, and we talked about this in the earlier works, at this point, it's not really quite a threat to the NBA. It's not quite seen as an option for a lot of NBA players yet. That does quickly change. But it was not in the third year. And so when we look at the value of Walt Frazier, and we should note, if you're a New York Knicks fan, Walt Frazier's nickname is Clyde. So the value of Clyde is in his first year, he's worth $80,000. He's paid $25,000. His second year, it's $200,000. He's paid $50,000, and then it's $240 and $75 is what he's paid. And then after that, he gets a big pay increase. His pay goes from $75,000. He signs a new contract with the Knicks. He gets paid $300,000 per year. It's a $1.5 million contract over 5 years, $300,000 per year. And now you see that his MRP and his salary are pretty comparable. They're actually pretty similar. And again, that's consistent with earlier work that as the ABA becomes a competitor to the NBA and starts actually seen as a legitimate option for the players, salaries go up pretty dramatically. But before that, if you go back to 69-70, you can see NBA players are paid between 34 and 41. Excuse me? Question?
I think that might have been someone not on mute. I'll just find them and mute them. Dave.
Okay. All right. That's fine. All right. So the players were paid between 34% and 40% of revenue in the late 60s. And again, that's consistent with earlier work. So the point of that was, again, that's not saying anything tremendously different than what I said before, but it gives a point of reference for when we now talk about the WNBA. The player that I'm going to focus on in the WNBA is Asia Wilson. Asia Wilson, like Clyde Frazier, is 6'4". They're the same size. They also led their teams to 2 titles in their first 6 seasons. They were on multiple All-Star teams, multiple first and second All-Pro teams, multiple first All-Defensive teams. And so in that sense, they're somewhat similar players. Now, Frazier plays point guard, Wilson's center power forward, but there's a lot of similarities between these two players. So, and again, Asia Wilson is playing at essentially the same point in time in the WNBA's history that Frazier played in the NBA history. So we want to know, same point in time, very similar revenues. Is Asia Wilson getting paid just like Walt Frazier was getting paid? So we do exactly the same steps we did earlier. We allocate how much revenue goes to the players. So if players are getting 50% of the revenue, they'd be splitting $100 million. WNBA does have a minimum wage. And so it's quite a bit higher than the NBA minimum wage. WNBA has a very compressed pay schedule. So the minimum wage in the WNBA day is $62,000. There's not a huge amount of difference between, at least relative to what we see in the NBA, between minimum and maximum in the WNBA. So $62,000 is the minimum. If we go through and figure out the value of a win, all players get paid $62,000. So they'd be paying out $9.7 million in minimum wages. That leaves $90 million for everything else. And so the value of a win is $339,000 in 2023. And then we go through and we say, okay, the WNBA, like the ABA and NBA, they actually track the same box score that we see today. So they actually do have data on offensive and defensive rebounds, turnover, steals, block shots, all that stuff is there. So we can do a pretty accurate measure of how many wins they produce. A'ja Wilson in 2023 is worth about 8 wins. That actually works out to be a little bit more productive than Walt Frazier was, because Frazier's season was 82 games and A'ja Wilson's only playing 40. So it's actually, and also the minutes are fewer because the WNBA is only 40 minutes and NBA is 48 minutes. So if you adjust for all that, A'ja Wilson's a little bit more productive, but it's very similar. And so if you go through and you do the marginal revenue product of Wilson, 62,000 is the minimum, $339,000 per win. There's 8.6 wins. She's worth about $3 million is her MRP. Now, when you go to her salaries, you see that in 2023, she's worth $3 million. She's paid in 1970 terms, that would be $380,000. She's paid only $200,000 today. In 1970, she'd be paid $25,000. So she's quite a bit underpaid. If you go back to 2019, you see, A'ja Wilson was not as productive earlier in her career, but it is still the case that in every single year, she produces more revenue than she is paid. She is dramatically underpaid. And if you go through and you look at the top players in the WNBA in 2023, these are the top 10 players. You can see that their MRPs, if you just do the same thing we were doing before, there's a minimum wage, you allocate the rest according to wins. The top players are worth between $2 and $4 million. And their salaries, the salaries are very compressed. So the top players only make about $200,000. So there's this vast difference in what they're paid and what they appear to be worth. And when you compare MRP to average salaries, see, WNBA players only paid about 10% of league revenues. And so, again, NBA players, late 60s are paid they're paid about 30 to 40% of revenue. WN players paid about 10%. I had a way of illustrating this in the paper that I thought of. So back in the 70s, this is something that you notice when you go back and you look at the coverage of basketball players in the 70s. So you have to understand the time period. This is 50 years ago. Professional sports, college sports, for much of the 20th century was dominated by white males. And we get into the 1970s and the NBA becomes a league very much dominated by African Americans. And so a lot of the media reports were very focused on the behavior of African American athletes. And so one of the things that you see is the New York Times decided to report in 1973 that Walt Frazier was being driven around New York in a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce. So they made something about that he's got this chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce. They also made a big deal about the way he dressed, and so that was something that they focused on. I thought it was interesting sort of to think about what if A'ja Wilson wanted to drive around in a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce. Again, she's basically the same level of productivity. She's working in a league with the same amount of revenue. So one would think that she should be able to afford something like that. Well, a Rolls Royce back in 1973 cost about $25,000. So it's not something that Frazier, who's making $300,000, he could afford something like that. That's not beyond his price range. A Rolls Royce today is about $500,000. And so A'ja Wilson would have to play for 2 years to afford one, and then she wouldn't have a chauffeur, obviously, and she wouldn't have any money for anything else. So I think that sort of, that little story kind of highlights why we see, this gender wage gap. I spent a little bit of time. Go ahead. Yes.
Dave, Jorge's got a question for you.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so sorry to interrupt today, but this is really interesting. I have a short question because I mean, I'm wondering if the NBA is cross-subsidized by the NBA. The WNBA is cross-subsidized by the NBA. So,
Okay.
I mean, because the way you're doing it, I am understanding that, you know, you're considering that in 1970, the NBA revenues come from what they generate, and now the WNBA revenues are generated by what they generate. But if there is cross-subsidization, you know, maybe you would have to adjust a bit.
Okay, so this is like a movie, and so we're in the middle of the movie, and your question is effectively, I think Darth Vader is his father. We're getting to that. We're going to get to that story. We're going in that direction, so we got to keep going here. So that's the story. We're going to talk about the NBA WNBA relationship. That is the very next thing that we're going to be moving to. So that is where we're going here. So I always do that in classes when students are like anticipating where the lecture is going. So wait a minute, it's a movie. You got to wait till the end.
Sorry,
So,
I have to leave in 15 minutes, but I was so sorry for that.
Yeah, it is. You are there. There is a very big issue with the NBA actually being very involved in the WNBA's finances, and that's going to be so. Right now, all I've done so far is tell you a very, very typical story. That this is nothing I'm saying here is terrifically surprising. This is something that we talked about in Neff Walker and I talked about this in Slaying the Trolls in our last book. This is sort of a prelude to something that I'm going to talk about next that came up this last summer after our book came out. And so we're gonna move into that whole thing about how the NBA is linked up with the WNBA, because that Susan Hebert quote is going to be pretty important in a second here. So let me just continue. You're going to see what kind of where this is going to go here. All right. Okay. So let's see. Let's see if I can. How come I keep trying? So can you? Yeah. Let's go back to the slideshow again. All right. So we got the slideshow. There we are. All right. All right. So I spent a little bit of time in the article just talking about why there's a gender wage gap. To me, the most obvious explanation is gender discrimination. And one of the things I taught gender economics for a number of years. It's a little bit frustrating when you read the economics literature that often economists kind of skip past that explanation, that when they talk about why women are treated differently in the workplace than men, they sort of try to come up with some explanation that is not just the obvious one. But I thought I would spend a little bit of time saying, well, let's just think about the other explanations. There is a rival league the NBA faces that might explain why the NBA players are getting paid much more. But that if you go back to the 1950s, when there is no rival league for the NBA, we know from congressional testimony at that point, the NBA was paying its players still 30 to 40% of its league revenue. And so that's not really the story. Mark Cuban made an argument once about 7-8 years ago. He was the owner of the Dallas Mavericks, that when leagues are young, they don't pay very well. And again, that's not true. When the NBA was much smaller than the WNBA, they paid much better. Then there's the WNBA profitability story that we're going to talk about again in a bit. But there is an argument the NBA constantly makes that the WNBA is not profitable. They simply don't have the money to pay their players. There is lots of reasons, and we actually have an entire chapter in Slaying the Trolls for why that story is not very believable. But it is the case that the NBA also insists the NBA is not profitable. The NBA provides no evidence the WNBA is not profitable. There was a very bizarre story that came out in the New York Post last October. The WNBA, by every measure, made a huge leap in 2024 that we're going to talk about. And after this huge leap, the NBA came out and said that losses in the WNBA increased 4 times. And it's like, okay, at this point now you're just being kind of silly. That just doesn't make any sense at all. So there's lots of reasons to doubt that story, but that's going to be important as we go forward. We're going to come back to that. All right. The the NBA came out with that story that WNBA losses increased 2 or 3 days before the WNBA players opted out of their collective bargaining agreement, which led everyone who's, sports economists who pays attention to these things would say, okay, the reason why you did the profitability story is because you knew they were opting out. And so that's the first thing that the NBA always does when it negotiates with its own players is it insists that it's not profitable. That's always its first point. And so it's not surprising that New York Post article appeared right when it did. There is some hope people have that the WNBA will negotiate a better deal. I'm a little skeptical of that simply because the NBA players have been dealing with the NBA now for 40 years, and in every single negotiation in the last 40 years, I think it's fair to say the NBA has lost. The NBA players have lost. They keep making concessions to the NBA. In '83, the NBA players agreed to a cap on team payrolls that reduced player pay. In '95, they agreed to a cap on rookie salaries. In '99, they agreed to a cap on veteran salaries. In 2011, they agreed to a cut in the amount of revenue they were getting. It went from 57% down to 50%. And so, the WNBA, perhaps they can do better than the NBA players have done, but the NBA seems to be very good at these kind of negotiations. And so I'm not sure that's going to happen. But despite that, we want to talk about what WNBA players are likely to be worth after this new collective bargaining agreement goes in. And so this is it. This is where this story now ends up being different. This is kind of what motivates this whole paper here, is the WNBA makes a huge leap in its revenue this last summer. So in 2023, if you go back and you look at what we know about the WNBA revenue, we know that the total revenue from Bloomberg was $200 million. We know that their national broadcasting deals were $60 million. So the other revenue sources had to be $140 million. And that's year 27. And the WNBA was at $200 million in its 25th year. So 25th year, 27th year, very similar point. In 2026, the NBA just signed a new television deal. Now, here's the deals on the new television deal. The new television deal works like this, and we're going to talk about the reporting on this because it's a little bit odd. But we do know that we've had reports that the NBA is getting a $76 billion television deal over 11 years, and that the WNBA is going to get $76 billion. WNBA is going to get $2.2 billion over 11 years, which means that broadcasting deal is now, and there's also some other WNBA sources of television deals. So we know that the broadcasting deals are going to jump to $260 million in projected revenue. And so we end up with total revenue is now going to jump to $467 million. That's going to be in year 30 for the WNBA. That would be equivalent to where the NBA was in year 37. So basically, the WNBA is a couple of years behind in 2023, and then by 2026, they're like 7 years ahead. So they make this big leap. And so let's go through and figure out what Asia Wilson would be worth in 2026 if we're at $467 million in league revenue. So the players are going to be splitting 233, 50%. Now we're going to consider two allocations. They get 10% or they get 50%, because right now they get 10%. So if they get 10%, they're going to be WNBA players will split 46 million. If they get 50%, they'll split 233 million. Okay. Minimum wage, we're going to allocate the minimum wage the way the WNBA does it. And so if it's so one split, if it's at 10%, the minimum wage would be $161,000. If they're splitting 50%, the minimum wage would be $800,000. Okay, but we're going to do the percentages exactly the same way that they're currently doing. We're not going to say they're going to change that. We figure out the dollar value of a win, allocate the minimum wages, and then split the rest by wins. At a 10% split, each win is worth $81,000. At a 50% split, it's worth $406,000. All right, so that's the same first three steps. Step 4, this is this is different. This is new. So I started calculating the value, the productivity of an NBA player. I started doing this. I started thinking about this question. Something like 25, 30 years ago. And it took a while for me to figure out, how does one figure out what a player's box score statistics are worth in terms of wins? I published an article in '99 about this, where that is wrong. I do get people who request that article. Can I have a copy of that article? And my position on that is, if you can't find it, I'm not giving it to you, because it was wrong, and so I'm not sharing it. Then later, Tony Krautman and I did an updated thing of it in an article that we published in Economic Inquiry. That was still not quite right. And then when I was writing The Wages and Wins, I came up with a better way. And in The Wages and Wins, I described it in words. And then in 2008, Brad Humphreys edited a volume, and I published a paper called A Simple Model of Productivity. And that detailed, what I was thinking. And I basically used that model with a couple of tweaks since 2008. What ended up happening this last year is I don't want to say I work with the Minnesota Lynx, because I really don't work with them. I simply I know Cheryl Reeve, and she's a friend of mine, and so she was nice enough to share some data that they've been collecting. And so there's a company called Second Spectrum, and they began tracking defensive data for the WNBA. And what they've done is they record on every shot who's the closest defender. So this is one of the big problems in thinking about defense in basketball, is that, well, you can say that, player A is defending player B, but you really don't know on any given play who's doing the defense. So what Second Spectrum does is simply say, whoever is closest, we're going to say that's the defender, which I think that's a pretty reasonable assumption. And so given that data, we can now, instead of treating defense as a team activity, which is the way I did it back in 2008, because we didn't have individual defensive data, we can now actually go through and figure out every player's individual defensive contribution, which means basically everything that explains outcomes in basketball is now being allocated to individuals. So there really is nothing, there is very little left there's a little bit, but there's very little left at a team level. It's all at the individual level. When you do this for the WNBA in 2024, the average effective field goal percentage is 49.5%. Nafisa Collier was named Defensive Player of the Year. She had 438 shot attempts where she was the closest defender. Players shot 39% on when Nafisa Collier was the closest. No player who faced 25 or more shots did better on defense than Collier, so it's not surprising she was Defensive Player of the Year. So we can now allocate defense to the players, and it doesn't dramatically change our view of the players. Nafisa Collier gets the biggest bump. So if you treat defense as a team variable, she's worth 5.8 wins. If it becomes a player variable, it's 6.7. So there's about a 1 win increase based on her defense. These are the top defensive players in 2024. And so Asia Wilson is one of the top defensive players. So and so as is Caitlin Clark, as is Arike, as is Breanna Stewart. So these are the top defensive players. And so now that we know, that measure of wins, we can go through and calculate marginal revenue product for Asia Wilson. So at 10% of revenue, that's her minimum. 81,000 times 10.8 wins, she's worth $1 million. So if they keep it at 10%, given the uptick in the broadcasting deals, Asia Wilson's pay is going to go from 200,000 to $1 million. And if it's at 50%, which is what the NBA gets, then it goes from roughly 3 million to 5 million. So WNBA players are likely going to get a pretty big pay increase. And you can look at the top 10 players based on what they did in 2024. If they do the same thing in 2026, this is what happens to their pay. So their salaries in 2024. So Caitlin Clark is paid $76,000 because she's on a rookie deal. If she gets in 2026, I don't know that she might still be on a rookie deal then, but if she was not, she was a free agent, her pay would go to 1 million. If they did a 50% split, it would be 5.3 million. And so these players would see a substantial increase. So that sounds like, we kind of have sort of a happy ending here. WNBA players are going to get a significant pay increase, even if they stay at 10% of revenues. And so that's sort of a nice story. It's still the case that a player like Diana Taurasi, who got paid $1.5 million to play in Russia a decade ago, she would still, we're still not up to 1.5 million yet, but we're doing better. We're doing way better than so it's better. So it sounds like a great story. And we could stop the paper right there, but that's not really this paper. This is where the story changes, and we find out that Darth Vader is the father. So this is Adam Silver. So this is what's really interesting about that deal that they made. So the deal gets reported. The NBA, WNBA, this is how it was reported by Badenhausen. The NBA and WNBA reached an agreement with Disney, NBC, and Amazon on a new round of TV deals worth $76 billion over 11 years. And the WO earned $2.2 billion over the life of the deal, or $200 million a year, according to someone familiar with the agreement, which represents a 6 times increase. Then Badenhausen says this: last month, the Washington Post reported that the new media deal would not assign a specific figure to the WNBA rights, but would be determined by the NBA instead. And that is really what this paper is about. So we go back, I want to go back. So here we got player values here. So we went through and said, these are the revenues. This is what you're worth. There we are. We have an economic value of the players. And again, way back at the beginning of the paper, I said, we did this for Major League Baseball. We did this for the NBA. People have done this for college football. People have done this for college basketball, softball. And so we've done this story again and again and again. But this strikes me as very different. Here's the issue. In measuring the economic value of an athlete, we start with the revenues generated by the team or the league. And so those revenues are a reflection of market transactions between the team and the league and the people who are willing to pay for the product. So we think that's their market value. But in the WNBA, we have this case. What if another entity is determining the size of your revenues? So years ago, Peter Von Allman and Mike Lees and I wrote a paper where we talked about fixed revenues. Fixed revenues are revenues that don't vary with wins. WNBA media deal is not just fixed revenues. I was trying to think of a good name for what we're looking at here. One name I thought of is arbitrary revenues, because it appears that this is arbitrary. But I settled on the term exogenous revenues. These are revenues determined by some entity outside your organization. And there is a question here whether the NBA actually determined these correctly. When the WNBA media was announced, Cheryl Miller, who's a legend in women's basketball, came out and said very strongly, I'm not great with numbers, but this is a low ball offer. That's a low ball. That's not even close. I'm not trying to inflate it a whole lot. $2 billion is nice. $8 billion would be better. Terry Jackson, who's the head of the Women's WNBA Player Association, said, we have wondered for months how the NBA would value the WNBA and its media rights deal. Again, she's making it clear the NBA is determining this. With a reportedly $75 billion deal on the table, the league is in control of its own destiny. More precisely, the NBA controls the destiny of the WNBA. We look forward to learning how the NBA arrived at a $200 million valuation. There is no excuse to undervalue the WNBA again. So this is something, kind of odd about this. And this is another thing I want to note, and this is sort of a side note in the paper, that the WNBA had a big uptick in attendance and a big uptick in television revenues, and it carried over to the WNBA finals. The WNBA finals between the Lynx and the Liberty went 5 games. It was a very exciting WNBA finals. Again, I'm friends with Cheryl Reade, so I very much buy into her story that the Liberty very much didn't deserve to win. The play at the end, that was clearly a foul. But nevertheless, it was very exciting. But this is something that was really odd about the reporting on that, is that they said, when they released the ratings deal, they said that the WNBA Finals was the most watched WNBA Finals in 25 years. Well, that doesn't make it. 25 years ago, the WNBA was only like in its second year. How could it, the record had been set when the WNBA was in its second or third year? Well, there's a story about that. When we think about how these revenues get determined, getting back at the discrimination story, there's a story. Mark Shapiro, who is an ESPN executive, ESPN acquires the rights to the WNBA, and he decides, despite the fact the WNBA was getting ratings that today we think of as record-setting, he says no one watches the WNBA. He said that back at that time. And he decided to move WNBA off of ESPN onto ESPN2. And after that, the ratings just tanked. It was very difficult to find the league. And so the ratings, that's why there's this story of why does it take why is this a record from 25 years ago? And so that's sort of like an underlying story in all this, that there's this underlying discrimination. But the WNBA, nevertheless, it appears the ratings are going up pretty dramatically. And so if we go through and we think, though, about whether that deal is right, this is the ratings that we see. WNBA regular season averaged 1 million viewers per broadcast. The WNBA playoffs averaged a little bit more than that. The NBA regular season is at 1.5 million. So there's not actually a huge gap between the NBA and the WNBA in terms of average ratings for regular season game. Playoffs for the NBA are more. They get about 4.5 million. If you think about how many potential games you can broadcast, the WNBA doesn't have as many games, the NBA. So the potential viewers for the WNBA is 361 million. Potential for the WNBA is 2.4 billion. So if you think about ratings should dictate the value of the deal, well, WNBA has 13% of the viewers. NBA is 87% of the viewers. And so instead of it being 2.2 billion, if it's a $76 billion deal and the WNBA is getting 2 billion, what they should be getting is closer to 10 billion. 13% of 76 billion is closer to 10 billion. And so it's quite a bit of a different outcome there. That should be 200 billion. It should be 200 million. That's an M. So per year, it should go from 200 million to about 900 million per year. So that's actually a very different amount. And again, it's important to note the WNBA is not negotiating this deal. I did speak to some people in the WNBA that I know. I asked them, hey, did you negotiate this deal with Disney and Amazon? And they were very emphatic about it. They were like, we did not negotiate this. The NBA negotiated this. The NBA is the one choosing what we're getting. And if the NBA is choosing what we're getting, well, then that's not quite the same thing when we think about what players are worth then. I would also point out that I mentioned earlier, the NBA claims the WNBA loses money. They claimed up until 2018 that the losses were $10 million per year. In 2024, they argued it was $40 million. If all of that's true, the WNBA lost about $310 million in nominal terms across its first 28 years, or about $440 million in real terms. But given this difference in television deals, it's a $700 million difference per year, which means the WNBA is giving the NBA $700 million in a subsidy every single year over this 11-year media deal. And that means the WNBA is now subsidizing the NBA rather than the other way around. And so that's something, to think about is that if the NBA is indeed, as Cheryl Miller putting it, lowballing the NBA, if the NBA is lowballing the WNBA, then now it's the WNBA subsidizing the NBA. And I went through and I said, okay, what would be the value of the players given this? At 10% of league revenue, if we go with the $900 million broadcasting deal, Alyssa Thomas goes to 8.8 million. If it's 50%, she goes to 22 million. Again, these are players who are making currently $200,000. And so this gets at, the big question here. Which MRP value is correct? I did a whole bunch of different estimations. Should we value the players in terms of the media deal the NBA announced? Is the correct MRP estimate where we consider what the WNBA media deal is likely worth given the league's revenues, television ratings, when league revenues are exogenously determined by, it is not really possible to answer that question clearly. So when we think about the value of Asia Wilson, we can argue that, well, she looks like she might be worth something like $20 million in 2 or 3 years, not worth 200,000. But again, it's difficult to know that given the nature of how the revenue is determined. So there's 3 stories in this paper that are being told. One is there is a gender wage gap in professional basketball. The NBA employs both women and men to play professional basketball. NBA players are paid 50%. WNBA players are paid 10%. WNBA players are still paid less than Walt Frazier was paid in nominal terms 50 years ago. So there is definitely a gender wage gap. Second story, the WNBA is now leaping past where the NBA was on its growth path, even if we take the NBA revenue number as given. And so the WNBA is now equivalent to where the NBA was in its 4th decade or 5th decade. And then the last thing is this story of exogenous revenues. And that is this thing that, well, if we don't know what the revenue value is supposed to be, then how are we supposed to figure out what the economic value of the players is? And so when we look at men's professional leagues, the owners own the league, and they're the ones negotiating the deals. The WNBA owners are not negotiating their own deals. The revenue numbers are being assigned to them by another entity. And that means calculating the value of a WNBA player becomes somewhat difficult. And so that is my story this morning. So hopefully that was fun. So how long are we going past the half-hour mark, or how are we going?
We can go as long as, we notionally finish up at 4 p.m. UK, so that's still another 40 minutes off.
Okay, well
so
then we have time for questions.
Yeah.
All right, then let's do questions.
Pete has already got his hand up, so Pete, go ahead.
I want to notice that you start with the 50% revenues for the marginal revenue product. Those might be low, so there might already be labor exploitation going on, because as you said, in any negotiation that's taking place, the players lose. So I'm just pointing out that yours is probably in some sense an underestimate of what could be if they were paid like European soccer players.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we could start at 70%. I mean, that's definitely 60-70% is where the Europeans are at. So yeah. And also I would point out that I keep saying 50% of basketball related income. That is a little deceptive. I had a problem in an earlier article. I kept looking at 50%, and I would look at the salaries, and I'd look at what I know about the revenues, and I was like, you add them all up, I ain't getting 50%. Why am I always off? And then I read the small print. Larry Kuhn has a salary cap frequently asked question thing, and if you go through that, he has a little footnote, and in it he says, when they calculate the revenues, basketball related income leaves out. They do this thing with the suite revenue, and so when it comes to luxury suites, the NBA takes 50% off the top, and then they split the other 50%. So if you do that, NBA players only get 40% of the revenue. They don't get 50%. They get 40%. So it's even worse than it looks. And that's the thing about the NBA. They're really good at these negotiations. They do crap like that. And one thing I would note also is that the NBA, when the story first breaks, the way they tell the story is NBA gets 76 billion, and we're going to give 2 billion to the WNBA. And then as the weeks go by, the story evolves, and suddenly reporters are saying the WNBA negotiated a $2.2 billion deal. And I reached out to an owner I know, and I said, did you negotiate this? He goes, we never negotiated this. The NBA didn't like the way that sounded when it sounded like they just made up the number. So they now are telling reporters that the WNBA did it on their own. It's like, so they're just lying? Yes, they're just making up something.
And if they were really losing money, there wouldn't be needs for expansion like they've been talking about. in the
Oh,
WNBA.
the expansion numbers are ridiculous. Every city in the world wants a damn WNBA franchise now, and it's like, well, I thought you were all losing money. Yeah, it's so ridiculous.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so yeah, and the reporters I know reporters who question the WNBA, but there are certain reporters, and it's really frustrating. They will report what the NBA says verbatim as truth. So when the NBA says WNBA loses 40 million, they will report that as a fact. And when I wrote at Forbes about 6-7 years ago, I got in trouble as an editor because what I would say in my articles is the NBA asserts the WNBA is losing money. And he said, you can't say it that way. Why not? That's all they did. He goes, it sounds like they're lying. That's because they are lying, but that's not really what the term asserts is actually a factual statement. That's all they did. So reporters report these things. And everyone who does like stuff on stadiums gets irritated that people do this all the time. Reporters don't like to question people. So, it's fun.
Thanks, Dave.
Great. Thanks, Pete. Jeremy has his hand up as well.
Yeah, Dave, thank you for the presentation. That was a lot of fun to listen to. I guess a little sad too, but fun, right?
Yeah.
I don't really understand what the incentive would be to shift allocated revenues from the WNBA to the NBA if the NBA players are garnering a higher percentage of revenues, right? Wouldn't the incentive be reversed? If you can get if the WNBA players get a smaller percentage of revenues, wouldn't it make sense to try to shift some of that joint revenue away from the NBA to the WNBA so less money is going towards athletes, right? Like what's the incentive there to shift money?
They're also splitting the revenue with the WNBA owners too. So there's that entity out there. So any revenue, so if they're shifting, I mean, I think are you saying that I only have to pay the players 10%, so I get 90%, so I want to do it that way?
I mean, in a sense, right? I mean, obviously there's
but you're leaving out the WNBA owners. WNBA owners get half of the 90%.
So even then, what does that ultimately come out to in terms of like the NBA?
I think if we did the math, I think you're better off splitting with the NBA players than you are splitting with the WNBA players and the WNBA owners. I think it would come out you'd rather go at the other. I think so, but you have a good question there. I haven't done the math, but the WNBA owners, they get 42%, and then there's a capital raise. Some investors that are not NBA, they get 16%, and then the NBA gets the other part. And so it's kind of there's other entities that get WNBA revenue besides NBA owners. So I think my guess is if we did all the math, it would go that you're better off shifting it WNBA to NBA. That's my guess, but we'd have to actually break out a piece of paper and go through do all the math and figure it out. But there are these other. See, the WNBA did and one of the owners I know got really angry about this. WNBA did a capital raise, so they kept saying we're losing money. So they did a capital raise. They sold off 16% of the league for $75 million, and this owner was like, are you insane? This league is going to be incredibly valuable in like 10 years, and you gave it away for $75 million. What are you thinking about? He was very incensed about this. He said, you just gave it away. And so, he was very upset how short-sighted that was, that you have no faith in this product. You're just letting it go for nothing. And so you have this entity out there where there are this capital raise, there are these investors that put up $75 million. They get 16% of everything. And those are not NBA owners at all. So, and then there are some other owners that are NBA owners. So they get part of the WNBA. And there's other owners that are not NBA owners, and they are separate. So you'd have to actually go through and say player share, WNBA owner share. They're not NBA owners, and then there's capital raise. I think it comes out that it's better shifting the other way, but I'm not positive about that.
Sounds like a nightmare of a collective bargaining setup when you have.
Oh, it's terrible. It's so weird. It's so weird if you've we've all done sports economics for a very long time, so we're very accustomed to the dynamic being, there's owners and there's players and they don't like each other and they argue. And when you talk to the WNBA, it's like you have the owners and the coaches and the general manager and the players are all on the same team and they all hate the NBA. They're all like, the NBA is screwing all of us. And they all say the same things. It's so interesting watching them talk about it because the WNBA, the owners understand that when you pay the players $200,000, they do stuff like create their own basketball league called Unrivaled, and now they're off playing this league. And I'm pretty sure this is true. Every owner, every coach, every general manager is watching these games and going, please don't get hurt. Please don't get hurt. Please don't get hurt. Please don't play that hard. It's not that important. And the thing about Unrivaled is that this is just the WNBA stars. It's all the stars going against each other, 3 or 4 times a week in a 3-on-3 game where they're just very intensely going at each other. And it's the chance of injury seems pretty high. And there are these teams that are like, my season is hanging on this thread where my star player is about to blow out a knee and I'm going to lose my whole season. And I said this to Cheryl Reeve. I said, this is a weird dynamic. Nafisa Collier owns the Unrivaled League. I said, how's it going to be coaching a player who owns their own league? How does that work? I can imagine Nafisa, in a practice or a game going, I don't want to question you, Cheryl. I mean, I only own my own league. When I own my own league, in my league, we do it this way. But you do it however you want to do. It's like, that's a weird dynamic between a player and a coach. I'm a league owner. You're just a coach. But okay. Very strange. It's a very strange setup. It's very weird. And so the owners don't like that. They don't want things like Unrivaled. They don't want the players playing in Europe, but they can't pay the players more to get them to stop doing that because the NBA won't let them. So
can I ask a second question?
Sure.
So you give us this snapshot. You compare the WNBA year 30, NBA year 30, and you kind of show that the relative success of the WNBA, right? Does the growth to get to year 30 look comparable between the two leagues? Does the NBA grow? I get the sense the NBA's growth was probably a little flatter, whereas maybe the WNBA's growth is more exponential, but maybe that's the wrong perception.
Yeah. Nola Egg and I both, we did this article. It's in the aggregate, it's kind of the same, but if you look at it, it does appear like it's statistically different because there's a bunch of stuff going on in the WNBA that didn't go on in the NBA. One of those things is that the league looked like it was doing really well in its first 5 years, and then Mark Shapiro, as I noted, tanked it. So it was getting these ratings, and then they took the league and they shoved it off on not just ESPN2, but it was a running joke for fans of the WNBA as recently as about 5 years ago that finding a WNBA game on television was just, it was a game because there was no consistency in when it was broadcast. And by no consistency, I mean, in a given week, a WNBA game would be on at 10 o'clock in the morning or at 10 o'clock at night or 4 in the afternoon, and it would be on like 4 or 5 different stations. So if you wanted to watch the WNBA, you had to guess the time of day and guess the network it was going to be on. It was just ridiculous. I don't know why there's no ratings. Well, how could there be ratings? Nobody knows where this is. And so if you look at the attendance data, it looks pretty consistent to me up till about 2017, 2018. And then it kind of levels off. There's another thing that went on where the Liberty deliberately tanked their attendance. So the Liberty were getting 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 fans a game. And then James Dolan decided to move the Liberty out of Madison Square Garden to an arena called Westchester, which was 40 miles away outside of New York, in an arena, in a basketball gym that had 3,000 seats. And so their attendance goes from 10,000 to 2,000. And you're like, why'd you do that? Because I want to. It didn't make any sense. His argument was, well, I don't make that much money in Madison Square Garden. You own Madison Square Garden. What do you mean? You own the damn thing. What difference does it make? So it was just really kind of weird. And then the Washington Mystics did the same thing. They decided to build a practice facility. Ted Leonsis owns the Wizards and the Mystics. He builds a practice facility for the Mystics and the Wizards. And then he builds a little arena next to it. And they went from 7,000 fans down to 4,000 fans. And so when you look at the attendance data, it's like, well, it looks like it's following the same path. And then these teams do weird things. And then you're like, I don't know what the hell that means. So it's kind of the same, but it's not exactly the same. I don't know if that answers your question. So that's, you know.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Kenneth, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I guess I could still ask. So I was just wondering why we haven't seen, like, for example, the in the NBA they had competition from ABA. Why do you think that the WNBA didn't feel the same pressure from the European leagues? I know it's not necessarily all one league over in Europe, but I mean, there's also some very good European players that could be middle to lower end of the WNBA, but they choose to actually stay over in Europe. And like as you kind of alluded to, also the Russian oligarch that paid Sue Bird and Diana Taurasi a couple mil in salary on top of crazy other benefits. So why didn't you kind of see that competition drive up the WNBA salaries, or more players just only play in Europe?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't really know the answer to that. It's interesting. I think when you look at the National Women's Soccer League and the European Soccer Leagues, the National Women's Soccer League just abolished their draft. And I think that is in direct reaction to European leagues, because if you have a draft in North America and there's no draft in Europe, what you're saying to every college soccer player in the US is that if you get drafted, you'll only negotiate with this one team. And if you don't like your deal, you're going to jump to Europe and the league loses the talent entirely. And so they clearly recognize each other as competitors. And I think they're also playing their seasons at the same time as well. The WNBA and Europe are not playing at the same time, so there's that. So it's not the same overlap. You can actually do both. And so there's that. There is a preference. The players have made it very clear that their preference is to stay in North America. And that does appear to be a very strong preference. And so they don't seem willing to. There was Diana Taurasi did it. She opted out of a WNBA season and played a year, just stayed in Russia. But most players don't seem willing to do that. And so the NBA takes advantage of that, the fact that they're not willing to do that. And so I think that there's an issue that the women don't simply want to just go to Europe and live in Europe, or go to China, or go to Russia. And I think the NBA takes advantage of that, but it's not really clear, why those aren't perfect substitutes, like they are in soccer. Because in soccer, clearly, I think it is the case that soccer players see them both as the same, as equivalent, or a lot of them do, because you do see Americans jump to Europe. So,
yeah, I mean, you see it a little bit with the NBA, like these G League guys, they could be making way more money in Europe, but or even lower level kind of NBA bench players, but there's this home bias that, I mean, we also see.
Yeah, there is a strong home bias, and I don't know. It might reflect the fact Americans aren't very worldly. So there is that.
Yeah, I mean, as an American now in Germany, I understand a bit. But if I may, one more question. I agree. I mean, I come from both the NBA league office side and also the WNBA kind of general manager and like management side. So, but I do agree that the WNBA players themselves are underpaid. However, one might argue, if you're comparing the state of the NBA in the 70s, I don't know exactly. I can't say I wasn't around then. To the state now, I would actually argue they do make up some of that, I guess, loss in salary with amenities like better facilities, now getting even better travel, these type of things. It seems like the lifestyle, although not where it should be, is a bit, I guess, if you would say, luxurious than the NBA was back in the 70s.
Maybe. It depends on the team you're looking at, and that's only recently begun to change. So it's only in the last couple of years that the WNBA teams have started building facilities that we would consider luxurious for their players, and there are teams that still are reluctant to do that. I do not know what the NBA's facilities were. You're probably right. They're not exactly the same in the 70s. And charter flights don't begin in the NBA until we get to the 80s. So you're right about that. But even if you consider all that, the gap in pay is still pretty incredibly huge. It's a really large gap. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kenneth. Georgi has his hand up as well.
Yeah, just really quick. Thank you very much for the presentation. Always very interesting to listen to you. A very captivating story. So, as someone who was born in Russia, the story there, playing basketball, growing up with talents like Sue Bird and Lauren Jackson and Becky Hammond, etc., who were all paid very well. To what extent do you recognize that, maybe there's a qualitative story here as well, that for the NBA, for the WNBA, being a much younger league than a league, say, is in Russia or Turkey, there just aren't enough super wealthy donors who are willing to pay all that much, that, basically the WNBA model is mostly built on how the NBA was built. It's like, yeah, we have a TV deal. Maybe to what extent do you think that's pushed, and perhaps all, the WNBA is just understand the percentage analysis, the revenue share of the league. To what extent might the league benefit from an ultra wealthy donor, for instance, if a former NBA legend or someone from the basketball world would invest heavily in the WNBA? I know this might sound, there are a lot of counter arguments to that I can already see, but just like to play the devil's advocate.
Well, the NBA, they already do have ultra wealthy donors. I mean, the NBA owns half of it. That's a wealthy donor. It's an $11 billion entity. But also, there are a lot of NBA owners who are ultra wealthy people who own WNBA teams. And so, the Aces are owned by Mark Davis, who owns the Las Vegas Raiders. So he's got tons of money. Ted Leonsis owns the Wizards. He's a fabulously wealthy guy. So there already are incredibly wealthy people. There's only, if I think about the ownership of the WNBA, I think the Seattle Storm would probably count as a team that's probably not tremendously wealthy owners. That's my guess. But most of them are, I think, owned by fabulously wealthy people. We talk about this in our book. There does appear, when you look at ownership in women's sports versus men's sports, we call this in the book an emotion gap. When men own men's sports teams, it's pretty clear they don't just financially invest in the team, they emotionally invest. And so you'll see them at the game. I always tell students this, the way to think about this is, Jerry Jones owns the Dallas Cowboys. And the Dallas Cowboys are financially a very successful organization, but they don't win the Super Bowl. They haven't won a Super Bowl in 30 years. And I tell my students, I said, if you thought of the Cowboys as a business, like Jerry Jones owns a Taco Bell, if you thought of it that way, then you could imagine a scenario where during a game when the Cowboys are losing, somebody would walk into Jerry Jones's ownership box and say, I just want to tell you, Mr. Jones, concession sales today are off the charts. God, we're making a ton of money today. This is great. Jerry Jones would throw something at that person if they were losing. I don't give a crap what our concession sales are. We're down 2 touchdowns here. There's this gap. And then when it comes to women's sports, you will often hear the way they talk about it, the way James Dolan would talk about the Liberty. We didn't make money last month. We're not making money. We're not making enough money. I don't know when we're going to get a return on this investment. And it's like, it's so weird, the language difference, because, Dolan doesn't talk about the Knicks that way. He talked about the Liberty that way. And so there's this gap between, even though they have the resources and they have the money, they treat the women as if it's just another business, and they don't treat it as this is something that I'm doing, and very much the way European sports owners treat their teams. It's like the objective here is to win. I don't give a damn how much money I spend. I just want to win the damn game. And women don't get treated that way. They get treated very much like an investment. So I think when we think about why are the women paid so little, I think it's because they set it up. They're like, well, I don't want to pay them. I think that's the most obvious explanation. I don't want to. I just don't want to do it. I don't feel like I have to, so I don't want to. And you say, well, why don't you just change the rules? Because if Mark Davis had it his way with the Aces, he'd pay Asia Wilson $2 million a year if he could, but they won't let him. The guy who owns the New York Liberty now, the NBA said, we're not going to give charter flights. We don't want them having charter flights. And the guy who owned the Liberty he said a couple years ago, he said, I will personally, because I'm a billionaire, I will pay for charter flights for every WNBA player in the league. I will just pay for it. And the NBA said, no, you can't do that. And then what ended up happening was this. The reason why they got the charter flights is Caitlin Clark joins the league. She's a major star. She was doing charter flights at the University of Iowa. And they do a story in the paper, and they ask Caitlin Clark, how are you going to feel about flying commercial, Caitlin? She goes, well, that's going to be a bit of an adjustment. I'm used to flying charter flights. And a week later, the NBA announces WNBA players get charter flights. And I talked to people in the WNBA. I said, when did you find out about that? They said, the same time you found out about it. They announced it in the paper. They didn't call us and tell us they were doing that. We've already made all of our flight arrangements for the year. And then they call us and tell us, hey, you're going to get charter flights now. Oh, I'm sorry. We already booked all our tickets. What are we supposed to do now? It's like they do stuff like that. And you're like, why are you doing that? Well, we're just making up these decisions as we go along. It's just this disconnect between the way the NBA does things and the way the WNBA owners want to do things. I think that's such an important story to tell when you think about, what WNBA players are being paid and why they're paid what they're paid. So.
Yeah, precisely. So just to follow up quickly, thank you for the response. So that's what I was hinting at, right? So European owners, especially the Russian model. So the specific oligarch you're referencing might be Shabtai von Kalmanovich. It's like the way he would do things, he would pay out of his own pocket to just have those players come play. Whereas, as you rightfully mentioned, like in the WNBA, they're seeing this as a business model that's number one. But even if there are these ultra wealthy people that want to make the league better, want to bring player accommodations, like, for instance, with charter flights to the level of the NBA, they're getting slapped on the hands by the NBA. So basically the NBA is the root cause. It's not that, anything else is happening. The explanation is awfully simple, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's been that way from the beginning. David Stern created the WNBA. It came out of the 96 Olympics. David Stern was saying, look, women are half the population. It's a big fan base, a big potential market. Women's basketball was really huge at the 96 Olympics. They got huge audiences. They got huge TV ratings. He said, we got to get in the women's basketball business. And the owners, you can tell from the behavior of these owners early on. They're like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do this. And, and so he basically forces this league upon these owners. And within 3 or 4 years, a few owners completely bail on it for ridiculous reasons. Paul Allen, who is the Microsoft guy, obviously worth billions. He owns the Portland Trail Blazers. He owns the Portland Fire. He bails on the Fire after 3 years and says, well, they're losing money. And this is in a world where the NBA was actually paying the players' salaries for him. We're going to pay the salaries for you. You don't have to pay that. Hey, I'm losing money. How much money could you possibly be losing on this? And you're a Microsoft billionaire. What the hell do you care? I don't want to do this. You're making me. I know. And so he bailed on it. And it's like, why? The Portland Fire were doing well in terms of attendance. I don't want to do it. And so the obvious explanation is, well, this is gender discrimination. You don't like women's basketball. And you're like, that's the obvious explanation. So James Dolan held on longer, but he was a major source for years for stories about the WNBA is losing money and not doing well. He was constantly telling reporters these stories. And eventually he sold the team, but he totally sabotaged them before he sold them. And it's like, why are you doing that? Because I don't like it. I don't want it. And now it's looking a little silly, right? Because it is the case. This league is, it's taking off. These revenues are quite high. Even if, again, even if you just take the $2.2 billion deal that they claim, that's still a pretty big increase. If you go to 10 billion on the broadcasting deal, which is probably closer to what the ratings say, well, then now you got a league that's in the 5th decade of the NBA. And it's like all these owners that bailed on it, you're like, this was going to be a huge business if you just would have stayed with it. But you didn't want to. So.
Great. Thanks, Yogi. Kenneth.
Yeah. I've been thinking actually more about this NBA WNBA comparison and what are we to make? Maybe I'm having some trouble, difficult understanding. But what do we make of this minimum salary difference in the comparison? Isn't this like orders of magnitude higher?
Oh yeah.
For the WNBA, so this would also make it kind of hard. Am I right here? That would also make it kind of hard to kind of make that comparison. It's, I guess, it kind of makes the WNBA, when you're trying to calculate their value, this kind of inflates their numbers when compared to the NBA, correct?
Well, the minimum salary, the minimum salary exists because I think if you weren't paying at least $50,000-$60,000, the women just wouldn't play. You got to pay them something. You got to pay them enough to make them do this. So there has to be a higher minimum wage than in percentage terms than you'd see in the NBA, because if they were to do the same kind of percentage, then that minimum wage would probably be like $10,000, and then women wouldn't show up. So I guess that would be beneath their reservation wage. But it is the case that because the minimum wage is so much higher, and they also have a maximum wage that is compressed, it's a very compressed salary structure. And so the difference between minimum and maximum is so much smaller in the WNBA.
Right. So, but my understanding is the marginal, kind of equation that you're, with all the wins, times the multiple, like the wins as the multiplier. The minimum salary is what matters, not necessarily I guess, the difference between the minimum and the maximum, or the maximum, or the percentage.
It does, by using their minimum, it does deflate what the value is going to be for the MRP. So we're taking that as given. But you're right, if we did it the NBA way, we could recalculate it another way and say, what if we did the minimum wage the way the NBA does it? And then we would get still yet another number. And I think that gets at the point of the paper, is that I think ultimately, if you go back to what Gerald Scully seemed to be thinking in 1974, there is a unique value that we could estimate that tells us what an athlete is worth or what a worker is worth. Mm-hmm. And another thing that I've tried to make clear in the different articles I've written in the last few years is that I don't think that's true. I don't think there is any unique value. I think it depends on how you look at it. And I think this gets at a fundamental idea in economics, is that we tend to think that there is for all workers, there is a specific value that's what they deserve to get. That's what they're worth. And I think when you think about sports, you're like, well, it does, even in a world where you can measure productivity and you know what the revenues are, you still can come up with lots of different reasonable estimates of what somebody is worth. And then it comes down to, well, then what is somebody actually worth? What do they deserve? It's like, well, it depends on how you look at it. And so I think that's a broader philosophical question that I think tends to be worth discussing. I think when I think about when I've taught labor economics in the past, it does seem like the traditional labor economists kind of just assume that there is a value out there for workers that somebody could figure out. And they could say that person is worth X. And I think when you study sports, you find out I don't know that there is a specific value. It does depend on how you think about it. And you could come up with reasonable ways of thinking about it. We've already said, that we started off with Peter's comment. What if you said the revenue was 70%? That's what we see in European sports. Well, if it's 70%, now the values are higher. What if it's 50%? Well, now it's this. What if it's 40%, which is really then it's this. What if we change the minimum wage value? Well, then it will be this. And so you can come up with all these different ways of doing it, and they're all reasonable ways of doing it. And then the question is, and then I've added in this another thing, what if the underlying revenue is just arbitrarily chosen and it's not even something that you negotiated? Well, now what are they worth? And then you end up with, okay, now the number of estimates I'm getting we're now getting to like a half dozen. And so then what is Asia Wilson worth? I don't know. What do you want her to be worth? We don't know. It just becomes really hard to answer that question. And then what I would like, and I would point out, it does seem to me that other economists don't listen to sports economists very much, but I would have, if to the extent if they would, I would like other economists who don't do this kind of research to then now think about, how often are you assuming in your research that somebody actually knows what a McDonald's worker is worth, or how do they know that? And if you can't tell, then what does that mean for what you're saying? And so that makes life a little bit more fuzzy.
Yeah, I mean, I can't answer that last question, but and I know we're running short up on time, but I think also when we're talking about valuations and worth, something that I've been looking at is kind of shapely values and coalitions. Mainly these two Italian guys, they did this with like optimal roster construction. It's using shapely values, but you can also, I think, apply that also to, given a set salary cap and a set amount of roster spots, certainly do kind of these valuations using some, I think actually shapely values are the best way to do this type of stuff.
Okay, well, we are hitting our time limit. So thank you very much, Dave. Really, really fascinating talk, as always, and always very entertaining and delivered as well. Fantastic slideshow, very informative. For those of you who don't necessarily know too much about basketball, but nonetheless, the sporting applications are really clear. Obviously, you talked a little bit about the different labour market arrangements in different sports. So thank you very much, Dave. Thank you to everyone who contributed as well. It was a really very interesting talk. Thank you, everyone. We have a break next week where a few of us, so Rob Simmons, I know is going to be there, and a few of us will be up at Boundary Park Oldham Athletic for the Football Finance Analytics and Economic History Conference next Friday and Saturday. So that's no roses next week. And we're going to come back the week after, February the 21st, when we'll have Scott Baker talking on gambling, away stability, sport betting's impact on vulnerable households. So thank you very much, everybody. Wish you all a fantastic rest of your day and weekend, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
All right. Thanks for having me, guys. That was fun.
Cheers, Dave.
Thank you very much.
See you later.
Cheers. Bye-bye.